Association's training on financial foundations for thriving communities, Treat Everyone Fairly. This webinar is approximately 2 hours in length and worth 2 continuing professional education credits based on a 50-minute hour. Hello? All participants' connections have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them using the Q&A feature in the event management system. And at the conclusion of the event, you will be redirected to a short survey to evaluate the content of today's presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to fill out those evaluations. Your CPE certificate will be sent to all paid participants in the mail in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. So, without any further delay, let's get started on our webinar for today. Again, we are talking about the Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities initiative. We're specifically talking about pillar number 5 of the initiative, which is all about treating everyone fairly. My name is Katie Ludwig. I'm a senior manager here at GFOA, and I'm going to, in advance, apologize. I'm getting over a cold, so I have a bit of a cough, so excuse me if I erupt into some random coughing today during the presentation. I'd also like to introduce my co-presenters today. So we have joining us in a bit will be Melanie Sampson. She's the content director of the Clear Language Lab at Literacy Works, which is a great organization based here in Chicago. We also have Krista Brown, who's the manager of the Financial Justice Project with the Treasurer and Tax Collector's Office for the City and County of San Francisco. Along with Ann Stoldrayer, she's the director of the Financial Justice Project and works with Krista. And then we also have Kelly Coleman and Brandon Crows from the Equity Office for the City of Austin. They will be joining us shortly as well. Excuse me again. Okay, so before we get started with my co-presenters, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on the Financial Foundations framework. So some of you may be wondering sort of why did GFOA come out with this framework? What's this initiative all about? Why did we bother to do this? Why did we research the topic? So we really found, this was really in response to a lot of concerns that our members had been bringing forth to us. So in fact, in our last member survey, 7 out of the top 10 members' concerns had in some way, shape to do with maintaining a strong financial foundation, financial sustainability, things of that nature. So really made us think that we need to kind of look into this a little bit more and really give our members some tools that they can use to help address these concerns. So why this framework? Why do we think this makes sense for people? What's so special about this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, of course, is that it does really make finance everyone's business. And we strongly believe that because everyone is involved in using local resources, there's lots of stakeholders. And all those stakeholders then also need to be involved in solidifying and strengthening those, your finances and making decisions about how those resources are used. This goes for both internal and external stakeholders. And the framework really does outline strategies for how to get those other stakeholders involved. It also goes beyond the numbers. Again, the accounting records don't tell the full story of local government finances. And sometimes, quite honestly, the numbers are the easy part. The hard part is often, right, figuring out how to get people to cooperate, how to manage relationships, how to get people to trust one another, those kinds of things. And again, this framework really can give you the tools to help you do that better. It's also, again, based on accurate models of behavior, really compatible with a lot of findings in behavioral sciences. We have a book coming out within the next few weeks here, and the book really does talk about this in a lot more detail, but there's a lot of scientific studies that have been done, behavioral studies that really do reinforce the concepts that we're talking about. So we didn't just make this stuff up because it sounds good. It really is based on theories that have been tested. And again, it does work. Not only is it backed up by that behavioral science, but it's demonstrated by real governments. We have lots of case studies. Some of those are in the book. We're gathering more, but there are real local governments that have utilized the concepts and the strategies outlined in the framework, and it really does work for them. Excuse me. So here is the framework. Again, I'm just going to very quickly kind of go over. We have the 5 pillars. So that first pillar is establishing a long-term vision. The second one talks about trust and open communication. The third is about collective decision-making. And then the fourth is about creating clear rules. And then the fifth pillar, which we're really focusing on today, again, is all about treating everyone fairly. And again, how we can promote and protect mutual trust, respect. You can see, and kind of as the graphic shows, these pillars really are interconnected. They work together. When you strengthen one, you also end up strengthening another one. Similarly, if one is weak, you're probably going to be weak in another area as well. So, again, I think through if anyone has been on some of the other webinars, I think you'll kind of see we've been making those connections on the different pillars. And our next webinar, which will be on the 24th, really is going to be how all the pillars come together. We're kind of calling that our putting the framework together into use. So what else does the framework include? It's made up of leadership strategies and what we call institutional design principles. So leadership strategies, these I think of as personal characteristics. So what can I as a leader do, right? I can't order people to do certain things. I can't just make people do things. I have to inspire them to do certain things. So these are the sort of leadership strategies, things that I can do as a leader within my organization to help make finances stronger, help build the financial foundation of my organization. Whereas the institutional design principles, those are really the characteristics of the organization. So what sort of things need to be in place within the organization in order for financial strength? What does the organization need to have in place, and whether that's policies or practices, things like that. And again, they work together because often you need to use those leadership strategies to put certain structures in place within your organization. So let's dig into this a little bit more. Again, we're really focusing on that pillar number 5 today, which, again, is treat everyone fairly. And that is, excuse me, treat everyone fairly. This pillar is comprised of 3 institutional design principles. So again, these are the characteristics of the organization. So we have, the first one is, again, proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So, what do we mean by that? Well, what we're trying to get at here is that people need to get what they pay for and pay for what they get. Local governments need to be proactive about this and make sure that citizens know what their tax dollars are being used for. So you can see clear communication really important to that. So if people are paying taxes for something, they want to know where that's going. And even if it's not enough just for you to say sort of, hey, trust me, I'm using this money in the right way. You really need to be proactive about how you communicate that to them so that they understand. The second institutional design principle is, again, conflict resolution mechanisms. So we know that there are going to be conflicts. We're dealing with really sensitive topics, things that people are very passionate about, so you're going to have disputes. So you need to anticipate that. You need to figure out what you can do to prevent destructive conflict and promote constructive debate. Not saying that all conflict is bad, right? Sometimes you can have really good debates about things, but you need to have structures in place, things in place to deal with that. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally, the third institutional design principle that we talk about here under Treat Everyone Fairly is minimum recognition of rights. And what we're talking about there is minimum recognition of the autonomy of the local government as it relates to state and federal government. Particularly, we think that local governments need to have policies and procedures in place to protect against things like unfunded mandates, and also to manage grants effectively. So again, I'll dig into that in a little bit more in a second. So I really like this quote. This is a quote from the Municipal Research and Services Center, which is based in Washington State. It talks about how clear communication is really important so that citizens understand how their tax dollars are being used. And I feel like the last sentence there is really a call to action for us. It says, more focused and understandable messages about budget decisions and tax dollar spending are urgently needed. So what this, how I think this is getting at why that idea of proportional equivalence is so important. And to me, very simply, you can't have a financially sound government in a thriving community if your citizens don't understand how their tax dollars are being used. And local governments, as a result, need to be really clear and deliberate about how they are communicating both budget and financial information. This communication can't be an afterthought. It needs to become sort of the way things are done. It really needs to be built into your processes. And we have a great presentation coming up with some really good tips on how you can communicate more clearly. Again, I think sometimes communicating budget financial information can get difficult. Sometimes these tasks, it's a little complicated. People have varying levels of knowledge and understanding, but we'll have some good tips to share with you shortly. Melanie from Literacy Works is going to give us some really good tips. Just want to touch a little bit more deeply on conflict resolution mechanisms. A couple things we talk about that we think really can help, and one of those is incorporating idea of procedural justice into your decision making. This can avoid a lot of destructive conflict. We talked about a destructive conflict as opposed to constructive debate. Some of the features of, key features of procedural justice are, one, that decisions are based on accurate information and shared accurate information, that everyone understands the data that is being presented. Second piece is a transparent and consistent set of decision-making criteria that is applied to everyone equally, or to all situations equally. So so the first one, again, is the data. The second is sort of the decision-making criteria. Everyone's clear on that and understands that. The third piece is that all stakeholders are given the opportunity for input. And then the fourth one is that mistakes are recognized and corrected, because nobody's perfect, and we know that we are going to make mistakes as long as you recognize and correct those. So those are sort of, again, those four key components of procedural justice that really, at the end of the day, people might not like the final decision that you're making, but the hope is that if you use these concepts related to procedural justice, that they understand it and can accept the decision being made. Again, might not like it, might not fully embrace it or love it, but that they understand it and accept it. The procedural justice can be particularly useful when you're dealing with collective bargaining situations, and it also can be useful if you're thinking about implementing any type of priority-based budgeting, or you're really weighing different programs, initiatives against each other. These concepts, again, of procedural justice can really be useful in that regard. Again, sharing information and the transparent decision criteria in particular, I think. The other thing I wanted to touch on is a model, conflict resolution model called Crucial Conversations. This was outlined in a book that was first published in 2002. Lots of organizations around the world have implemented this model. We have a really good example in our book that talks about King County, Washington. They adopted this model in 2013. And it really, I'm not going to go too deeply into everything the model entails, but it really is just a way to approach difficult conversations, hard topics when there is disagreement about things. And so King County did some initial training with staff on the model, and then they also do, I think this is a key for them, they offer frequent shorter trainings. After they did that initial training, they now do frequent shorter trainings where people can practice, because I think a lot of the times we learn these skills, these kind of conflict resolution things, but then we might not get a chance to practice them. So they do these shorter interim trainings where people can practice those methods. And this has worked well for them, and they've really, again, fully embraced it. And it's kind of showing they have a little bit of data to back up how it's improved things for them. Their employee engagement scores are 15% better than other governments that they benchmark themselves against. And in a lot of ways, they credit that to the crucial conversation training that they've done with staff. Another conflict resolution model that's out there is called difficult conversations. Again, we talk a little bit about that in the book that's coming out. That's been implemented in the city of Roanoke, Virginia. They've had great success with that. The point here that we're really trying to make is that you know, whatever model you go with or anything like that, you just need to have some sort of plan in place to deal with conflict and anticipating that. And don't just ignore it, because I think sometimes we just kind of hope that if we ignore it, it'll go away, and really that just often does make things worse. So I'm going to move along and talk very briefly about this idea of the minimum recognition of rights. So again, this is really based on the premise that the users or beneficiaries of the local budget are the ones who are in the best position to decide how to allocate resources. And that interference from non-local governments can disrupt agreements or arrangements that have been made at the local level, right? So you might have things laid out really great, and then the state or federal government kind of comes in and throws a wrench in your plans as introducing some sort of unfunded mandate or something like that. So again, the two things that the interference is often in the form of either some sort of unfunded mandate or onerous grant requirements. So we would just really want local governments to be aware of these things and to always read their legal documents carefully and understand what their actual, regulatory requirements or things like that, understand what they're really being held to, particularly when it comes to grants. We recommend that a local government should understand all grant requirements before making any sort of decision on whether or not to apply for that grant. And really, the best thing is to have sort of policies and procedures in place to institutionalize this kind of practice, really, whether that's like a grant review committee or something like that. But that if this is going to be something that your government pursues on a regular basis is grant funding, that you really want to have something in place so that internally you understand what those requirements are going to be. Not all money's free. Okay, so we've talked a little bit in more detail about this pillar number 5. So we have a couple of poll questions before we get started on our next presentation. So question number 1 here says, what does your organization do to promote proportional equivalence? And again, this is the idea that constituents pay for what they get and get what they pay for. So here's a couple options here. We say we have a program inventory and we regularly review the cost effectiveness of our programs. We communicate budget information clearly to the public. We have a user fee policy and we regularly review the fees we charge to determine if they are keeping pace with costs. D, we utilize evidence-based decision-making for resource allocations. We talked about making sure we all have accurate data, so this idea. And then E is all of the above, or F is none of the above. So can I take a second here and let us know what your organization does. Okay, so responses were a bit split. It looks like we have about 19% of people said C, that they have a user fee policy and review that regularly, and then about 19% of people said that they do all of the above. So that's great. And we had about 14% of people who said they communicate budget information clearly to the public. So that is great to hear what folks are doing about that. One more question before we move along. Question number 2 is, which of the features of procedural justice do you think your organization needs to incorporate more in its financial decision-making processes? So do you think you need to do more decisions are based on accurate information, having a transparent and consistent set of decision-making criteria applied to everyone equally, affected stakeholders given the opportunity for input, mistakes recognized and corrected, all of the above, or none of the above? Again, just kind of reflect and think about what you think your organization could do more of. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, so it looks like most people, about 24% of people said that they need more of using a transparent and consistent set of decision-making criteria applied to everyone equally, followed closely by all of the above, E. So that's interesting to hear. I'm not surprised. I think this is something that a lot of local governments could do better on. So again, thank you for taking the time to think on that. And next, we are going to be hearing from Melanie Sampson, again from Literacy Works, and she's going to talk to us about clear communication strategies. So Melanie, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. My name is Melanie Sampson, and I am with Literacy Works. We are based in Chicago, and our work over the last 2 decades has primarily been with supporting literacy programs here in the Chicagoland area. But in recent years, we really found the need for advocating for our adult learners as they go out in the world, because we know that they go to the doctor and the health care center and the government office, and they sometimes can't always access the things they need to access. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how some strategies that can help make things clearer for community members. Katie, next slide. As I said, my background is in adult education, so I have spent the last decade prior to working here at Literacy Works working with community members in Rogers Park here in Chicago, which is one of the most diverse communities in the city. I worked with refugees who were learning English for the first time up through people who were born and raised in Chicago. So that's really influenced my work here at the Clear Language Lab. I can't tell you how many times I had students bring to me things that they got in the mail, things from the government that they had trouble understanding, and frankly, sometimes I had trouble understanding too. So that's really something that I carry with me as I do this work. If you can skip ahead to the next slide, actually. Thank you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about plain language. What is it? It sounds like it's boring, but actually I think of it as sort of a philosophy or a lens to think about how I'm communicating information to the audience that it's meant for. And it can be tricky, I think, to go from sort of thinking about explaining things to other experts to explaining things to the general public or a specific audience that just simply doesn't have the same expertise that you have. There's actually a psychological principle called the curse of knowledge, and I think that it can sometimes be very hard to get over. The idea of how hard it is to explain content that we're experts about to non-experts, because it's our everyday. We live with it all the time. So it's not easy, but hopefully today we'll get a better sense of what that means to use plain language as a lens and a strategy in our work. I want to start with actually a real life example. Next slide. So I last year became a homeowner after being a longtime renter here in Chicago, and I got this is an excerpt from a real email I got. And as you can see, if you look at it, it is not written in the clearest way possible. Basically, so the short story, I needed to be able to show some evidence that I had done some things to my house to rectify them, and they weren't in disarray anymore when the insurance people came. But that being said, I got this email on a Saturday when there was no one I could call to ask questions to. I got this email when I was out of town. I was away and couldn't access a printer or a desktop computer. It was actually very bad weather. I was on my way to a hospital to visit a sick relative. So all those things combined with the fact that I'd never been a homeowner before. This was my first time dealing with homeowners insurance and a mortgage. And I read this email and got very stressed and very worried for a variety of reasons. Next slide. What were some specific things that were frustrating about this? One was the passive language. It made it a lot more complicated for me to have to figure out what was needed, what I needed to do. Very long sentences. The use of jargon made it less specific, dwelling versus just your house. There was also an abrupt sort of, your policy hasn't been canceled. Well, up until that point, I hadn't even considered that. So that, the way that was written, it was also very jarring. Another point of confusion was this email was sent on January 19th. And as you'll notice, it said that I was supposed to have completed these tasks by January 17th. So there is some disconnect there of timeline. I was able to rectify all this and get it taken care of. And when I finally talked to someone on that Monday, when there was someone back in the office, I found out that I actually had another month to take care of this, and that it wasn't that big of a deal. And that also I was supposed to be getting a card in the mail, but the email must have come first. So there was a whole array of things that made this much more of a complicated interaction than it needed to be. And I had the privilege that I was able to say to the person on the phone after we got this taken care of, and I knew that I still had homeowners insurance, that this wasn't effective, that there were better ways they could have done that. And I know there are many of our community members that don't necessarily have that same opportunity to voice their opinion or voice when they have concerns about how something is being conveyed. So that's part of the reason why this work is so important to me. Thank you, slides, yes. So plain language sounds like a bit of a misnomer. We're not talking about things being boring or overly simple. The idea of plain language is the idea that people could find what they need, then once they find it, understand it, and then once they understand it, they can go use it to do the thing they need to do. So this is a definition from plainlanguage.gov. There's also been recently, next slide, another group that's formed called the International Plain Language Federation that has a very similar definition. Plain language has been around for quite a while, but it's really gotten a lot more momentum in the last decade or so. In 2010, the Plain Writing Act was actually passed, applying to federal offices, but we've seen variation of how that's actually being implemented. There is a group in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Plain Language that rates federal agencies. They actually get a letter grade, like a report card. So that's kind of a fun thing to check out and see how different agencies fare. There's been a lot of change in the last couple of years with the administration change. So I think a lot of turnover means that some of the gains that were made now have been kind of lost a little bit. Can you skip? So that's just a little timeline. This is an example here of an actual project we did with the local government here in Chicago with the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. I think if you look from the left to the right, you can see, without even having to read actual words, I think you can see quite a bit of differences between the two texts. The one on the left is actually the original. This was a document that was used if you had to vote provisionally. I did not know what that was before I did this project, but now I can tell you it's basically when you go to vote and there's some sort of problem with your address or your registration. It allows you to cast your ballot that day with the idea that it's going to be reviewed before it actually counts. So this was the original document, and we were able to revise it to the version on the right. Some of the differences that you might notice, we've got a lot more introductory information. We have a title that kind of gives you an idea of what this is. There's a wider use of headings to guide the reader to make it more skimmable, so people don't necessarily have to read every word. They can read the headings, and that can guide them, which can make it faster and quicker for them to read. We made the action steps a lot more prominent, so people know exactly what they need to do, and just did a lot more grouping with information rather than sort of an endless list of bullet points. Thanks. So again, some of those things that I just talked about, thinking about the audience and what they actually need to know. On that previous example, we actually cut out quite a bit of information because we realized that A, the community member didn't really need to know some of those things, and B, it was actually causing more confusion. So if we left it in, we were actually going to need to add a lot more content to then clarify it. We worked a lot on structure and vocabulary as well, as you can see. So why is it important? In my work, I sometimes get some different opinions about writing things in a different way. Especially, I think it's challenging. We spend, as I said earlier, a lot of time writing to experts. It's a change in mindset to think about writing it in a different way. These are some of the types of things that I've heard in the course of my work, and I reiterate that we're not talking about. I really just detest that term dumbed down. That's not what this is. The idea is that we're making it very straightforward and clear for our audience. Next slide. These are some of the things I think we can think about in why we want to do this. Some arguments for why it's so important. Getting it right the first time. I mean, thinking about if someone's getting dozens and dozens of calls asking the same question, well, maybe that's not clear in the first place, and that's why we're getting those calls about that question. This idea of transparency and trustworthiness, as Katie talked about at the beginning. I don't know about you, but when I have to fill out one of those online things just to access Wi-Fi somewhere, and it's 10 pages long, and it has a lot of dense text and crazy vocabulary, it doesn't really induce in me a feeling of transparency and trustworthiness. I sort of assume that there's something nefarious going on, or that they are trying to kind of pull one over on me. Thinking about a trauma-informed approach, thinking about how strong communication, good communication can help ease the challenges of especially community members who've encountered a lot of walls and barriers when they've worked with systems, and how the systems haven't always served them well. Being reader-centered, again, thinking about the experience of that person as opposed to our need to tell them certain things, and finding that place in between. Again, thinking about reducing barriers and making things less complicated, and really thinking about the need of the person versus the need of the system, and how do we lift up the person. All right. I want to talk about, we talk about literacy, and that is sort of what's at the heart of what we do, but really recognizing that so many other things can affect someone's ability to comprehend. When I gave that example from the beginning, I had to read that email, I don't know how many times before I really understood what it meant. I was under a lot of stress. I was tired. All these sort of things can also play into our comprehension. So in the health field, we talk about health literacy, and I really think that applies to anything, this idea of information literacy. So we've got the concrete ability to sort of read and make sense of words and decode, but then we've also got all the background information and things that we need to know about a system. And, where do those merge is where a lot of my work lives. That being said, we know that literacy continues to be an issue in this country. Over 40 million people struggle with basic literacy skills, and that doesn't include, I think a misnomer is sort of the idea that people either read or they can't read, and really I think most people live somewhere in the middle, especially when it's compounded by those other factors we just talked about. There has been research done in this area. A group called Nielsen Normal did a really interesting study where they compared people with lower literacy and higher literacy and had them evaluate a website, a pretty run-of-the-mill website, and they found that not only did both groups do better, do it more quickly, do the activities with more satisfaction, but actually they even found that the people with higher literacy were even more excited about the changes to the website. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer that if someone has a lot more education, they always want things to be more rigorous. I think it depends on what we're reading, right? If we're reading something of interest, that's one thing, but if we're reading something that's task-oriented that we have to get done, that's not the same thing. In another legal study, Christopher Trudeau does a lot of research. He's a legal expert in plain language and found that readers chose plain language 80% of the time. And then the next quote I think is very interesting. It really resonates for me about what we've been talking about today and what Katie mentioned, but just this idea that when things aren't intentionally transparent, I think the idea here that it feels condescending and corrupt really resonated with me, and I think about that as I'm creating content myself. So what does this look like in a practice? So here's another example of potentially two different ways that information could be shared about sort of a regular run-of-the-mill sort of challenge of needing to pay a bill. I'm going to give you just a second. I want you to just think for a second. If anyone wants to chat some ideas, feel free to do that. But just take a second and maybe on a scrap sheet of paper, just jot down, what are a couple differences that you notice between these two texts in terms of how they're communicating information? One big thing, I think, feel free to shoot me some ideas, but one big thing that pops out, I think, to most people is just the density of the text. That we've got the text on the left is not easy to scan or skim. When someone has challenges with reading, they're often reading a little bit more word by word, whereas if we're really strong readers, we can kind of skip through it with a lot more ease. So we're kind of putting it on this person now that they have to start from the very beginning to try to find the thing that they're looking for. The option on the right, we've got the material split up a little bit more, so it's a little bit easier to look for information. We've got a leading heading, a leading question there that can help sort of guide the person and see, is this the section I'm looking for? Maybe they don't need to read any of this. This isn't actually what they need to know. We've got varied vocabulary, so we're not using quite as much dense vocabulary required to submit upon receipt. That's very formal language that's not necessarily how most people talk. So if people aren't doing a lot of heavy reading, when they encounter text like that, it can be challenging for them. We've also got difficult sentence structure. If the billing department is unable to obtain the necessary insurance information, that's a lot for someone to have to digest. We can use wherever we can use the you and the I and the we voice, that makes it easier for someone to understand, oh, you're talking to me, this is the thing I need to do. Also pulling out that information like the who to call, who to email, who to fax, just makes it that much easier for someone to find the thing they need to find. So there's many, many different rabbit holes we could go down with this, but just to give you a very quick visual, you can see some of these differences here between something written in maybe a more academic, complicated text and something written in a little bit more of a plain version. How does this play out in real life? This is an example of some feedback we've gotten from real life projects. This is actually in reference to that city document that I showed at the very beginning, that people actually could understand more what the thing was, so they weren't going through the process unnecessarily, which we thought was very successful. We got another one about making a process clearer and simpler because they revised their document for their organization, and this is someone who came to one of our trainings. And then we've also got another example about a brochure being easier to access and really just changing the information from the perspective of the organization to the needs of the reader, and that's what we did with this particular project. So what can we do? Thinking about being proactive. I think something I've encountered in my work is the idea that sometimes the frontline staff, I think, feel like they can make a difference in their specific lane, but to make these bigger practices, it's really important to have leadership involved. So I think those in leadership positions, I think thinking about this more than a checklist, but that this is really an opportunity to change the lens of how communication is being presented. Thinking about pain points, so what I mean by that is just, if the same mistakes are happening over and over again, people are filling the same form out wrong, you're getting calls about the same questions. I think using those as opportunities to explore how that can be clear, what hiccups are happening, what barriers are happening that's making this happen over and over again. Thinking about including community members in evaluation of the effectiveness of material. Do you have some sort of advisory committee or focus groups that can help understand the needs that people have for their information? There's lots of professional development available in written and spoken communication. I think that's important too, is we're not just talking about writing, but how do these ideas translate to those phone calls or those one-on-one meetings or going to community organizations. As someone who used to host a lot of people coming to visit, I'd oftentimes have to stand next to someone and translate, but in English, because there was sort of a canned speech that sometimes got delivered in it, and it wasn't always meant for non-experts, and it was definitely something I experienced a lot. And as we said, prioritizing plain language. How can this be something that is infused in the work in the organization? Some resources. If you're looking for some things that are more about like effectiveness and how this can reduce costs, maybe you're looking for the most pragmatic sort of arguments to make some changes. This is an interesting book, I think, worth reading. It's an easy read. Joseph Kimball is a lawyer who's a huge plain language advocate, and he has a book called Writing for Dollars, Writing to Please, that looks at government examples of how they actually were able to save money based on using more plain language practices. Plainlanguage.gov is the federal government's website, and they have a lot of good resources on there. And we'll actually be debuting a new blog coming weeks. We actually have, if you're in Chicago, we have a free workshop we do every quarter. I'd be happy to tell you about that if you're in the area. And I think that's it. Please feel free if you're interested in learning more about this. I'm happy to always chat about this. And you can reach out on any of our social media and email and all that kind of stuff. Thank you so much, Katie. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, Melanie. That was very helpful. I appreciate that. And we have a question for the audience. So again, we've talked about heard from Melanie about her tips around plain language. So what documents that your organization produces do you think could benefit from a plain language review? So think of the documents you produce. So maybe you have strategic plans or long-term financial plans, a budget book, any legal notices or citations, any type of program guides or things that people access where and when and how to get help, or all of the above. So kind of think on that, and if you would respond and let us know what kind of documents you think would benefit from this. Okay, the poll just closed. Let's see. Oh, folks, overwhelmingly, we had about 46% of people said all of the above. And we had about 14% of people said legal notices and citations, and then 11% of people said long-term financial plans. This is not surprising to me at all. I used to work in government, and I think I probably would have answered all of the above because I really, and actually that's where I first met Melanie, was in my previous work. I had some of my employees go to a training that she offered. So yeah, I think local governments can always do a better job on this. So again, thank you, Melanie, much appreciated. I think these kind of tips can go a long way in, again, helping us to treat people fairly and help them understand better the work that government's doing and how their tax dollars are being used, which is really key to building trust with our citizens. And again, without that trust, it's really hard to have a strong financial foundation in your city. So, or I shouldn't say city, county, local government. Okay, so let's move along. Next, we are going to hear from Krista Brown. Oh, wait, sorry, we have one more question. I'm very sorry about this. Question number 4 is, what can you commit to doing to improve the clarity of documents you play a role in producing? So Melanie had given us some tips. So what do you think are some things that are easy for you to do? Be proactive about common communication pain points, include community members, access professional development, prioritize plain language practices, or all of the above. Again, just take a couple seconds and respond here. Okay, the poll just closed. Again, we had people, over 51% of folks saying all of the above, that they could commit to doing all of these things, which is wonderful to hear. So again, thank you. Let's move along to our next presentation is from Krista Brown, again with the Financial Justice Project in the City and County of San Francisco. Krista, I will hand it off to you.
Great, thanks, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Krista Brown, and I work in the Treasurer and Tax Collector's Office here in the City and County of San Francisco, which is a long title. But essentially, our office oversees revenue collection for the City and County of San Francisco. And we really have a long history over the course of our current treasurer, who's been in office for about 15 years, of working to use the power of the office to help people access the financial mainstream, to start saving, and to build wealth. But a few years ago, about 3 years ago, we started hearing from community groups, impacted people, and San Francisco residents about some of the impacts of some of these government-issued fines and fees and how they were impacting some of our most vulnerable communities. We heard stories about people who got a traffic ticket and couldn't afford to pay it right away, so they saw their debt double or triple in size. They had their driver's license suspended for failure to pay, and ultimately lost their jobs. We heard from people who were struggling with homelessness, who were getting tickets for sleeping on the sidewalk and had no means to pay off the debt. And we also started hearing from departments in the courts that felt like they didn't have the resources they needed to tackle some of these problems. So almost exactly 3 years ago at the end of this month, we launched the Financial Justice Project. So we are embedded in the San Francisco City and County Treasurer's Office, and it's our goal to alleviate the inequitable burden of these financial penalties on low-income San Franciscans and communities of color. We listen to community groups, and we work with courts and departments to solve these problems. And really our approach, we first start by listening to the community members, legal service providers, nonprofit service providers, by identifying what the pain points are, what are the fines and fees they're seeing impact their residents the most. And then we really work with departments or the courts to figure out what can we do about it. What is the solution that makes it better for the low-income residents, but also works for the city and county to implement. And we really use this approach by starting by gathering quite a bit of information. So trying to understand what is the goal of the fine or fee. So with fees, as I would assume many of you know, the goal is to generate revenue, to cover costs, and to really cover the cost of operations for the city and county. For fines, the goal might be to change behavior, such as parking tickets or tickets issued if someone litters or jaywalks, but really to kind of change someone's behavior or deter behaviors. So we start with kind of that overarching context, and then we start by digging into who receives the fines or fees. Are these fines or fees that are issued or paid by people with a wide range of incomes? For example, parking tickets, you're just as likely to receive if you're high income as if you're low income. Or are they traditionally or primarily assessed to one group of people? For example, tickets for sleeping on the sidewalk may be more likely to go to people who are struggling with homelessness. We also look at whether they are primarily assessed to one demographic. So an example might be the fees someone is charged when they exit the criminal justice system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So once we've spoken with community groups, we've spoken with the departments and the courts, and we understand this context, we start to dig into what a potential solution could look like. And we really have seen over our last 3 years of work that there are a range of solutions that can work better for both the government and for people. And so in some cases, we work with a department to actually make a fine or fee sliding scale based on income. So if, for example, we worked with their courts to allow people who are low income to apply to have their fine reduced based on their annual income. In other cases, we've worked to create pathways to resolve the ticket that don't require a monetary penalty. So for example, can someone complete community service or educational opportunities? Or in the cases of someone who might be struggling with homelessness, can they take some of the steps to resolve some of these underlying issues that was the cause of the ticket in the first place? And then finally, we work with the city and county to understand, is this fine or fee something that should exist in the first place? Is it meeting its goal, whether that's revenue or behavior change? And are there better ways or more effective ways that we could be meeting those goals? And so if you could go to the next slide. So over the last 3 years, we have done a lot in partnership with our courts, our county departments, and our community groups. And on the slide in front of you is kind of a short summary of some of the reforms that we've accomplished over the last 3 years. We've worked with our utility company to examine the fees that are charged to someone when their water gets shut off, and found after a close examination that they weren't a great source of revenue. They were disproportionately impacting people living in poverty, and we ultimately chose to eliminate them. We worked with our San Francisco court to introduce new ability to pay processes where low-income people can request to have their fine or fee discounted based on their income. We've worked with our local transit agency to reduce the fees someone is charged when they have a boot on their car or their car gets towed if their income is below a certain threshold. And ultimately, we found that many of these systems can work better for low-income people and for government. And I think, Katie, you mentioned at the beginning that many of the issue areas that we've worked on over the last 3 years are not necessarily directly in the purview of our department. We don't oversee the utility company. We don't have direct control over the San Francisco court, for example. So all of this work is done in partnership through bringing people to the table, understanding the data and the pain points, outlining what a solution could look like, and then helping with implementation. And Melanie, I wanted to note one of the things we do as we look at the implementation process of these reforms is to make sure that they are accessible and easily understood. So that often includes, running the forms or the flyers that we create through readability softwares to make sure that they aren't the best kept secret in San Francisco. So I thought that to kind of get a little more specific and concrete about what this actually looks like, we could dig into two of the specific reforms. I don't think we have time to get into all of these today. So I wanted to speak specifically about some of the work we've done on criminal justice fees and some of the work we've done around our transportation payment fees. So criminal justice fees, our work really started when a colleague of ours from our public defender's office brought us this bill. So this is a real client's bill that someone would receive when they're trying to get their record cleared. So they show up to what's called a clean slate clinic. They're trying to get their record cleared, which would mean they are more likely to find a job or housing without that criminal conviction on their record. But before they can get their record cleared, they have to pay off the debt that is listed here on this bill. And as you can see, not the most readable document, Melanie, I'm sure you would agree, but really, for someone who is very low income, this is a really large amount of money. So they, at this point, they had been, exited the criminal justice system in 2013 and owed over $5,000. And so looking at this bill, we started trying to dig in, like where did all of these fines and fees come from? And found that they were actually all charged by different departments, by the courts, by different state or local legislation, and that I think very few people in the government really understood clearly how all of these fines and fees compiled for an individual. So for example, when we went and spoke with our probation department, they only charged one fee, and our sheriff's department only charged one fee, but few understood what it looks like on the end user or the end recipient side of the equation when they, basically exiting jail or the criminal justice system and getting a bill for $5,000. The other thing that really surprised us about this bill is that most people would assume the majority of people's debt is related to fines, like victim restitution or a fine that they had to pay related to their conviction. But in fact, the majority, more than 2/3 of the total debt, were administrative fees that were not intended to be punitive, but were intended to cover the cost of operations. So for example, in San Francisco, we charged people $50 a month to be on probation. And almost everyone was sentenced to 3 years probation, so they were charged $1,800 in administrative probation fees when they left the county jail. They're charged $150 to have a report run, $135 to get booked into jail, and additional fees to be fingerprinted, to have drug testing, and a variety of other kind of administrative fees. And so we started digging into each of these fees and kind of what they represented, what they meant to both the individuals impacted and the city and county of San Francisco. And if you could go to the next slide. So we found, as I mentioned, and that previous, the client bill made clear, people were, when they exited the system, were assessed dozens of fees, not fines, but administrative fees that added up to thousands of dollars per person. We found that the fees were almost exclusively charged to low-income people who could not afford to pay. And just to give some context around that, so in San Francisco, between 80 and 90% of the people exiting the criminal justice system were represented by a public defender, which they qualified for based on their income. And so 80 to 90% of the people who were getting charged these fees had already been deemed indigent by the city and county of San Francisco. We also saw that these administrative fees had a big disproportionate impact on our communities of color. So for example, in San Francisco, and this is common across the US, our African American population is about 5% of our total residents, but approximately 50% of the people in our county jail. And so we saw that these fees were having a huge disproportionate impact on our communities of color, and particularly the family members who were also working with the individuals to pay down this debt after they were released. Fourth, we found that these fees really created a major barrier to the reentry process. So the goal of the probation term is to help people successfully reenter, to help them find a job and housing and get that family support. And there's a lot of research that shows when someone exits with thousands of dollars in debt and no source of income, they're more likely to recidivate. There was also some research done that really showed, if you have to pay off this debt before you can clear your criminal record, that criminal record clearance, the barrier to that is a huge barrier to reentry in order to find housing and a job and all of the things that someone would need to get back on their feet. And then finally, we spent a lot of time looking at the revenue. So where does it go? Who authorizes it? How much is collected? How much is assessed? And we found that the fees are really not a very effective source of revenue, and we're not really meeting the intended goal to cover the cost of the program. If you could go to the next slide, I just want to say a little bit more about that. So for example, probation fees, which were that's that $1,800 bill someone would get charged when they were assigned probation. That's the largest fee that someone was charged in terms of dollar value. And the collection rate on that fee was 9% in 2016. And that's even when our courts who were in charge of that collections process referred to our franchise tax board and had the authority and often used wage garnishment, bank levies, and tax intercepts. So even though we were aggressively trying to collect the debt, the collection rate was 9%. And looking at the collection rates over time, like maybe people get back on their feet and they're able to pay it later in their lifetime, we found that the average collection rate across all of the fees over the course of 6 years was 17%. And so from the treasurer's office and our perspective, looking at a fee and seeing that the collection rate is, single digits or below 20%, there's something wrong with a fee that has that low of a collection rate. So if you could go to the next slide. So we worked in partnership with community groups, our mayor's budget office, our mayor, public defender, district attorney, sheriff, chief of probation, and many others, and ultimately determined that this was, the wrong policy. The fees were creating major barriers to reentry, which was the goal for the district attorney and the sheriff and the chief of probation. They weren't an effective revenue source, which is why the treasurer and the mayor's budget office felt like something needed to change. And they were having this huge disproportionate impact, as many people in our community were telling us over and over again. So we eliminated all of the fees that were in our local control, which was about 10 fees. And those fees, interestingly, made up the majority of the debt for most of the people who had been assigned these fees. So the majority of their debt resulting from their conviction. And then last year, we not only eliminated the fees for people moving forward, but we waived $33 million in debt that was stemming from these fees for about 21,000 people. And so the image that you see on the bottom of the slide is what a bill looks like for a client now. So for example, this particular person originally they were assessed a little bit over $2,700 in fees and fines. And after this legislation passed, their current balance is $640. So really showing that the largest proportion of the debt that many people owe when they exit the system were these administrative fees assessed by government. So that's just one example of the kind of a case where we eliminated a fee or a set of fees in this case. I also wanted to highlight another example that we worked on with our local transit agency around people paying off parking tickets, fare evasion tickets, or really any other debt that they might owe our transit agency. So one of the pain points we heard about really early on in our work 3 years ago was that people, when they got a parking ticket, In San Francisco, those can be between $70 to $120. They often struggle to pay it off all at once. Many people in our very expensive city do not have the financial reserves to immediately pay down a bill that's over $100. And if someone couldn't pay it within 30 days, they were immediately assessed late fees, which over the course could double the price of the ticket. And in speaking with our local transit agency, they noted that they did actually offer a payment plan and community service options, but that they were very underutilized. And in digging into it, we saw when someone needed to enroll in a payment plan, they actually had to pay $60 or more to sign up for a payment plan. So that was a payment plan enrollment fee that they would have to pay upfront just to enroll in the payment plan before they could pay off the entire balance of their ticket. And what we saw was that for people who didn't have the $100 to pay off the ticket, very few of them had the $60 to sign up for the payment plan and then pay off the $100. So we worked with our local transit agency to reduce the enrollment fee for everyone down to $25. And then for low-income people below 200% of the federal poverty level, which is about $25,000 a year, their enrollment fee would be $5. Not only would their enrollment fee be $5, but if they completed the payment plan successfully, all of the late fees that had been assigned to their tickets could be waived. And as I mentioned earlier, that can double the price of the ticket. I'll say a little bit more about the impact in just a moment, but we also worked with our transit agency to streamline and reform the community service option. So this is for people who have no income and want to pay off their ticket by performing community service. Previously, people had to pay $75 or more, depending on how much debt they owed, to enroll in community service. And what we saw was that for people who had no income, this was a huge barrier. And if they had no income and received a ticket, they really had no pathway to pay off this debt that was accessible to them. And so similarly, we worked with our transit agency to say, all right, for people below 200% of the poverty level, the enrollment fee is $0 to complete community service to pay off the ticket. And for the general public, it would be $25, so also reduced across the board. We also worked with our transit agency to really streamline the process to enroll in these payment plans or community service options. So we made sure that people can make partial payments online. We worked with our local transit agency to review our flyers and forms to make sure that they were around 8th grade reading level, at or around, to make sure that they were clear, the action items were understandable, and that they were accessible. And we also worked with them to streamline how people can get verified. So previously, people might have needed to bring in tax returns or all this proof to show their income. That was really burdensome for both the individual and the department. We worked with them to say, all right, can people just come in, and if they have a Medi-Cal card or an EBT card, which is what people receive benefits on, can they just show their card to get certified as eligible? And we also created a partnership with our local benefits human services agency to create some direct communications to allow people to be verified real time on the spot. And what we saw in the first quarter after these reforms were implemented is that enrollment in the payment plan went up 400% from the same period the year before, and that overall revenue went up as well from the same quarter the period before. And I think what that tells us, and what a lot of underlying research really illustrates, is that if people are assessed a fine or a fee that is beyond their ability to pay, say it's a $500 ticket for running a stop sign in San Francisco, if they can't afford to pay it and they have no pathway to pay it down over time, they will likely pay nothing. And then the city and county is stuck trying to collect on this debt that they're unlikely to collect on. But if you can streamline the process, if you can proportion it to someone's income and create a pathway for them to pay it off, what we've seen and what other jurisdictions have seen across the country is that compliance goes up, but revenue also goes up. And so this is definitely working better for both low-income individuals as well as the city and county. So those are just two examples, the criminal justice fees and the reforms to our transportation payment fees. But kind of give you a sense of the types of work that we work on. But I also wanted to mention that we do our best to be as transparent as possible. We learn a lot in partnership with our community groups and our partners and our, the courts and city and county departments. And so we really want to share our learnings with everyone else to make sure that they're useful for those of you who are experiencing similar challenges. So we currently have 5 reports out that detail our research and reforms in a variety of areas, everything from bail reform, criminal justice fees, overdue library fines, to child support debt. And those reports are available on our website, and the link is there on the page. And you're also welcome to follow us on Twitter or contact me by email if you have any questions. And with that, Katie, I think I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Krista. That was really helpful, interesting, I think, for sharing the work that you all have done. I think quite a few of as I was listening to you speak, I think a lot of the things that we talked about as it relates to procedural justice in terms of using accurate data to make decisions, including all stakeholders in the conversation. I think it was interesting how, a lot of what you talked about, you said got started really just by hearing people talk about what the pain points were for them, listening to stakeholders. So again, thanks for sharing. I think for folks who are interested in pursuing a similar type of initiative, I think that there's really some good tips there. So thank you. Excuse me. If folks do have any questions at any point, feel free. There's that Q&A functionality. I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but really feel free to type into the Q&A functionality. We will address those. We can address them during a presentation. We can also go back at the end and address any questions as well. So don't hesitate if you have any questions at all to use that feature. We do have one question based on Krista's presentation. So question number 5 here says, of the 3 potential solutions presented regarding inequitable fines and fees, which do you think would be the most feasible for an inequitable fine or fee that your local government imposes? So Krista talked about 3 different things there. She said that, in some cases you can base the fine or fee on ability to pay. You can create non-monetary solutions, community service, receiving social services, or you could just eliminate the fine or fee. So if you think about take a second and maybe think of something that could be inequitable, an inequitable fine or fee that your local government imposes, and what do you think could be a potential solution for that? So take a few seconds, think about that, and please respond. Okay, the poll ended. Let's see. It'll take a second here to calculate. Let's see what everyone said. Okay, so it looks like about 38% of folks, so kind of even split, but 38% of folks said create non-monetary solutions, such as community service or social services or educational opportunities. And then 24% said basing the fee or fine on ability to pay, and then about 14% of folks said eliminate the fine or fee. So interesting. I think that does make sense. Krista, sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add one quick note before we move on that I wanted to mention we're actually working with PolicyLink and a national organization called the Fines and Fees Justice Center to work with the cohort of cities across the country. And we will be soliciting and accepting applications for cities to participate in the project later this year. So if folks are interested, they are welcome to reach out to me by email. We would love to add them to our distribution list when we send out the application. But I think that will be a really important and great resource for people to learn more and to dig into this work in their own city as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So next we have a presentation from Kelly Coleman, who is with the Equity Office in the City of Austin. And Kelly is going to share with us a lot of the work that her office excuse me, is doing, kind of the history behind their office. But again, looking at a lot of the similar things we've been talking about in terms of including stakeholders in the conversation, using accurate information to make decisions, and this idea really of building trust, I think, is so important, and looking forward to hearing more from Kelly. So, Kelly, I will hand it off to you. Kelly? Hello? Brandon or Kelly? Oh, okay. Kelly is having a little bit of audio issues. Sorry, she just messaged me. They are going to try a different phone. So if you could give us 1 second, folks, just a bit of technical difficulties, but we should be hopefully resolve these soon.
This is Kelly. Are y'all able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yay! Great.
Thanks,
Sorry
Kelly.
about that.
No, thank you.
So I'm Kelly Coleman, and I'm here with my colleague Brandon. Hey, everyone. And I'm going to share just a little bit about how our office in the City of Austin was started, and sort of just a look back a little before. We want to connect the history of our city to the outcomes that we see for people of color here in the City of Austin, and really nationally, so that people get a sense of what has been set up. So this first slide we got from an article that our local paper ran. It was actually a really in-depth series around inheriting inequality. And we still see signs of, we still see signs from the segregation era, and our city is still suffering from the aftermath of what happened. Can you go to the next slide? And so this is an image of the first ward, and this is what our city looked like at the beginning. And it's interesting because at this point we had about 16 freedmen towns around the area in Central Texas. In Austin proper, there were 60 freedmen towns in the area of Central Texas. And so Black folks, Mexican folks, Native people, and white folks lived all over. And if you know anything about Austin, this is where a lot of development is happening today as well. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. And our 1928 plan is where everything changed. People come to Austin and they ask questions about why it's set up the way that it is, and really thought that people self-segregated, but actually it was a part of our planning. And, you know, you see here on page 66, there has been considerable talk in Austin as well as other cities in regard to the race segregation problem. This problem cannot be solved legally under any zoning law known to us at present. Practically all attempts of such have been unconstitutional. So this is the plan that actively segregated our city. And if you go to the next slide, created the Negro District. And so what that plan did was forced families of color into East Austin from all over the city. And if people did not move, they were not able to have access to city services like electricity, trash pickup, water, and different things like that. And so it forced people to move. Literally, community centers, churches, schools were removed and rebuilt brick by brick. And so this is just a map of redlining, right, if y'all are familiar with that. And then there's a little bit about here. There's a little here about, you know, the New Deal, and it reinforced segregationist boundaries in Austin throughout the country. It was designed to restore household wealth during the Great Depression, and it used redlining to exclude communities of color. And so Black folks were locked out of one of the largest opportunities to build wealth in this country around this time. Could you go to the next slide? In Austin specifically, right? And so here is another map that is more recent. And if you look at the little box on the left, it shows where poverty is concentrated. So the red parts are over 40% concentration of poverty, and the peach, beige parts are 20 to 40%. And so those areas are very similar to that segregation map, the redlining map that you saw earlier in the slide before. And so it's just really recreated the same thing over and over with very racially specific laws and policies to now where this is the connection. Right now we are not using racially specific policies or language, but because that's what our laws and policies are rooted in, because now we're being more racially neutral, we still see it. We're just building upon that foundation. Can you please go to the next slide? And so that brings us to urban renewal. We call it urban removal here in Austin. And actually this image, we have a historian in our office. She's an archivist. And she always uses this image to sort of drive home what it meant on the ground for folks. So it was intended to benefit or revitalize some of our Black neighborhoods where people were relegated to, but it just laid, runway for gentrification and displacement of East Austin. And these children, right, they look like they're having fun and hanging out. And the person taking the picture is just there to evaluate how much the homes are worth that they're going to sell, and these children won't have a place anymore. So it's just an interesting image, I think. Could you go to the next slide? So 2015, Austin is the best place to live in the nation, according to U.S. News and World Report, but it's also one of the most economically segregated cities in the U.S., according to the Martin Prosperity Institute. And also one of the cities one of the cities of our size growing the way we are. We're the only one that is losing its Black population. So we're able to hold all three of those titles at one time. Another piece of information is that we had an at-large council up until the end of 2014, and people in the community organized to have more of a neighborhood, more neighborhood representation. So now we have districts. So now we have a 10-1 with a mayor, one mayor at large, and we're a city management city. And we also have in 2009, we were named the #2 most family-friendly city in the U.S. And we've been named the best city for families, one of the healthiest cities in the country, and one of the healthiest cities for women, right? If you go to the next slide. We talk a lot about Austin being a tale of two cities, because while we're getting all of those accolades and awards, there are communities that are not benefiting from the prosperity and health. And this organization, Mama Sana, Vibrant Woman, is a community-based organization that provides birth support services to women of color in Austin because of the situation with maternal and infant health outcomes here in Austin. And they did several interviews, put together this report, and proposed 2 city resolutions in this report. One that was for funding health equity programs, because in our city we have a lot of white-led organizations providing services to lower-income people of color, where we're not seeing outcomes for those communities begin to get better. So that happened fairly quickly, but we also saw a resolution in that report where community was pushing for the development of an equity assessment tool. And at the time, this organization, you can go back to that slide. At that time, members from Mama Sana, Vibrant Women, and other organizations here in Austin that are buying for people of color came together and created a coalition called Communities of Color United for Racial Justice. And they are the ones that really pushed forward around health equity funding and the equity assessment tool. And so in 2015, the resolution was passed to create our office. If you go to the next slide. So the office was created. The organization CCU wanted an equity assessment tool and did not actually believe that a city could hold itself accountable, and wanted more of an an autonomous group of people directly impacted by inequities to be paid to have a lever to hold the city accountable. But at the same time this was happening, we have a Latino Hispanic Quality of Life Commission that wanted a diversity office. And so the mayor and council put the two together and decided that we'd have an equity office to administer the equity tool. So after a bunch of research around different tools and meeting with and building a relationship with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, we hired our first Chief Equity Officer, Brian Oakes, in October. Brian right away implemented that resolution to the T, because if you read the resolution, it names organizations. He brought those organizations to the table and several more. There were about 200 folks at our visioning, and we spent a year defining equity for the city of Austin. We also had over 900 hours of volunteer time in the process of creating that. Do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. And this is it. So this is in the city of Austin what racial equity means. Racial equity is the condition when race no longer predicts a person's quality of life outcomes in our community. And our city recognizes that race is the primary determinant of social equity, and therefore we begin the journey towards equity with this definition. The city of Austin also recognizes historical and structural disparities and a need for alleviation of these wrongs by critically transforming its institutions and creating a culture of equity. And there's an image there that Brian likes a lot. You go to the next slide. And I'm going to let Brandon talk a little bit about the tool and our dashboard and how we're doing the work in the city. We wanted to provide the history piece because we think it's really important to always start with history. We also wanted people to understand that our office came out of the community and our relationship with that community is still a really positive one, and that's how we try to stay accountable is through those relationships. And so we spend a lot of time cultivating those relationships and building trust. I was the first person that Brian hired in our office. I'm born and raised here. I was a part of that community coalition and a part of Mama Sana. So I was one of the organizers that was pushing the city. And so I've kind of flipped from being on the outside to inside of the institution and really trying to make the connection between an outside strategy and an internal strategy for transformative change. So I'm going to pass it to Brandon.
Appreciate that, Kelly. I kind of handle a lot of the data and program management pieces of this. So Brian and Kelly both thought it would be good to have me around for this. So just to take you through a quick background of the tool, like Kelly said, within that community body as they were looking at other cities, other tools that exist, they kind of landed on these 5 major sections that we needed to have within the tool. And so as Kelly said, we always start with history. So within the introduction, we give our departments kind of a really brief general history, kind of like what we just gave you. And then we also kind of push them to go and do their own research to understand the roots of their department. Because, I think one thing we're really clear on within the office is that regardless of your field of work or research or whatever you're doing, there is a racist history there. Just speaking from my own experience, coming from a statistical background, the father of modern statistics was actually the father of modern eugenics as well. And a lot of that early statistical research was grounded in trying to prove that black is lesser. He failed because, of course, it isn't, but that's another coda for another time. So basically, The tool is a really long survey. I think it's about 70 questions. In departments, it's a self-completion thing. That's partly in recognition of within our office there are only 6 of us, and we have a city that is over 13 or 14,000 employees total. So we can't be in all of these places or consult on all of these programs ourselves. We have to be able to develop people to hold that space for us. And so the assessment tool is equally like something to look at what they're doing and also trying to build that leadership within departments to hold these conversations. So the first real section that they go through is a departmental analysis, and this really looks at like culture, commitment, what you're doing now, what your workforce looks like, whose voices are valued within your department, who's identified for promotion, that kind of stuff. I think the thing most of you would be most interested in is in the budget. We always say that the budget is a moral document, especially as a city government. It shows what you value. It shows what you really want to impact. So we ask a lot of questions trying to tease out, you know, what you're identifying for funding, what is getting funded maybe disparately, what maybe isn't receiving so much funding that we could lift up and try and expand. We ask a lot of questions about community engagement, and I think for a lot of financial officers, one thing we've seen within our work is our internal service agencies don't really feel like they need to be that involved, or maybe they don't feel that direct connection to community. So we mostly hear that from financial services. We heard it from our IT, and we heard it from our human resources department. But for us, like looking at that, like that's the people, that's the capital, and that's the money. Like that if you can start to transform those things, then you can transform everything else. And for all of you, you're really playing such a central role in what programming is getting funded within the city. So I think trying to build that connection between something where you're maybe not seeing the community on a daily basis, but you're having as big of impact as anybody who is out there actually providing services within the community. And so we kind of had to tweak our community engagement section a little bit, but we definitely think that's something all of our departments need to be doing, working to understand the lived experience, and really, really being intentional about whose voices are being valued. And then the last section is kind of our alignment. We have our 5-year strategic direction within the city that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But we really try and tease out what departments are doing within that, and within that, equity has been identified as an anchor, meaning it cuts across all of our other outcomes. And so one thing we're intentional about is within all of our metrics, we say that there is a racial disparity and that we need to be intentional about measuring it and about going to correct it. If you could go to the next slide. And so one of the things we like to talk about a lot is sometimes people will ask us, like, especially from smaller cities, is like, oh, why do we have to play a role in this? Like, what is our role? And in particular, like lower level staff will say like, oh, what can I do like on a daily basis? My leadership doesn't support this, whatever. And we always say that just even small influences, small choices, like just asking one extra question can make a huge difference as you aggregate and as you roll up onto bigger things. And so we've identified these 5 areas of departmental choice between planning, budgeting, personnel, policy, and practices. And I think one of the things we're learning a lot about is sometimes we'll talk about policy versus practice, and people will be like, oh, doesn't policy inform practices? But I think one thing we see a lot in city government is we have a lot of practices that have never been codified into policy, but it's just the way we've done it for so long that it's become an unwritten policy. So as an example, just within our own work, we had a lot of work to kind of change the way we provide grants within the city. And one thing that got people really nervous is we waived all insurance requirements for the organizations that we're contracting with. And that got a lot of people within our city really scared. But the other thing is, like, it was never actually a policy that our organizations really, like, are totally required to. It's always been department discretion. So, like, for Brian, he can always waive that requirement, but nobody had ever taken advantage of that. Nobody had ever understood that's something you could do, and we kind of did some research. We looked into it, and there's like in the past 2 or 3 years, there hasn't been a single instance where there hasn't been any requirement for this liability insurance. So as you're trying to work with small community organizations, requiring them to have up to $50,000 in liability insurance is just this major administrative limiting factor. And as Kelly said, we're really intentional about those are the organizations, those are the people who are really going to be able to make this change to move us with this. So if you could go to the next slide. And so part of that is also within our accountability thing too, where we know within the city, like as great a work as Brian does, as connected as Kelly is to the community, like we can't be leading ourselves in this work. We are still a part of this institution. And the one thing that this institution wants to do is perpetuate itself. So complex adaptive systems, as Kelly whispers to me, basically meaning that even as we're doing our work, even as we perceive it as a strong thing, the system is adapting, the institution is adapting around us to kind of swallow that, to cut it off, to quarantine it in a way where we won't have as much impact. So continuing this relationship with the community, developing the community to be able to come into these spaces. And I just want to clarify one thing. I think there's always a difference between capital C community with city government and lower C community. So capital C community is kind of like the broader, flowery, oh, the City of Austin community, it's everybody and everyone. We're intentional about lower C community, meaning communities of color, meaning the people who haven't had access to these systems and institutions, people who still don't have access to these systems and institutions, and the people we see with the major, like the people who are always at the bottom of our quality of life outcomes. And so we really try and bring those into spaces, help them navigate our other departments, and part of that is the Equity Action Team. That was originally the team that helped us develop the tool, that helped us develop that equity definition. It's growing, it's continuing to expand, it's kind of morphing a little bit. Right now it's more of like a silo busting or like connecting thing rather than a working organization. We're sort of looking at ways to disrupt that, but it's really for a lot of people the only space where they can come, where there's city staff, there's people from our other major institutions, so the University of Texas or the Texas State employees. There's a lot of major nonprofits who show up and will come out. And then I think the most critical thing for us are the community organizations and the working class folks that we are able to bring into that room, to bring into these conversations and to hold us accountable. And so if you could go to the next slide. We also want to create spaces where if you aren't able to be in that room, but you are still trying to make changes within that, we want you to have access, we want you to have resources. And so I developed our departmental equity dashboards, and I'll kind of break out a little bit and talk about some specific things, but just want to highlight, like, you can see all of the staff demographics, you can see like the executive reporting structure, the budget, how many staff, just general information like that. You can see how many of the action plan items have been implemented, and I'll talk more about that later if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so my formatting on this didn't quite work, but basically I just wanted to highlight how you can see within every step of our assessment process the outcomes that are coming from that department. So as public health as an example, if you go to the dashboard and you click on that APH tool link, it'll pull up their actual responses to our equity assessment tool, so you can look at. And if staff identified, like, hey, this is a barrier for us, community can draw that out, point it out, uplift it, and say, like, hey, so you've identified this, or you identified this as a barrier, what can we do to help correct that or remove that barrier? You can look at their SWOT report. So after they complete the tool, we don't do an assessment of it. We send it to a partner over at the University of Texas to do a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. And so they can look at that too and say, hey, this was identified as weakness, just as another like shorter way of codifying that. And then from that SWOT analysis, departments will create an action plan where they identify specific items, whether it's expanding a strength, addressing a weakness or a threat, or leveraging an opportunity to impact equity. And again, that allows for a level of accountability within those departments where community can say, hey, you wanted to change this about this program, you want to start collecting this data. I see that you're not doing that. Why are you not doing that? Let's do that. And so if you want to go to the next slide. We also wanted to provide sort of just as far as like an organizing tactic, who staff, like other staff members within the city, but also who community can reach out to, people who have an analysis, who have been through our Undoing Racism workshop that we contract with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to facilitate. And that thing I think can be really powerful because for many of these community, like the relationship with the city has always been adversarial. It's not been a positive, like co-creative relationship. It's been a relationship of like, how much can I get? Like, can I get 5% of what I need, and can I count that as a win? We're kind of hoping that if you have these people identified, if you know who these people are and you have the ability to reach out to them, then you can start to create that inside-outside game where it's not just these people within this department trying to transform it, but it's these people in collaboration and co-creation with people within the lower C community who are trying to transform this. And so that's staff training. That's also equity action team members. As I mentioned, the team meets once a month. And so if it's a community member who's having some trouble with public health, as an example, they can show up, look for the people at that meeting and kind of have a one-on-one conversation and kind of tease out maybe some of the stuff that's going on with that. I think we're going to go to the next slide. Just as another, like one of the questions I think we usually get a lot too is how do you measure this work? How are you measuring your success? And it's really difficult, as Kelly mentioned, like we know our history pretty well, or like we in the office know the history pretty well and community knows the history, and we know our outcomes now. Like we know the community indicators, but there's a gap there where we don't know specifically within the city what we're doing and what we're doing to impact to create these disparities positively or negatively most often. And so we're always looking for opportunities of measuring equally like what's happening within a department and what that department's doing. So for the listening to the workforce, that's kind of like our like employee engagement survey. We were able to get 5 questions within that. And so they go out to each department, and I wanted to provide that on the dashboard as well so people can kind of measure where a department is at. I'll say it's not always the most reflective necessarily. I think people really like to say that it's valuable to discuss the impacts of race, and then you try and have a conversation about the impacts of race with them, and you find out really quickly that that 85% might be more of a 40%, but we're always trying and looking for new measurements, for new ways of how far our work is reaching and how far we still have to go. So if you want to go to the next slide. One other thing we do, I mentioned our Undoing Racism workshop. That's our foundational, like, shared analysis building space. So we want to be clear, want to be making sure that it's getting people to where we need to go. So we do pre and post testing on that around these 5, around the understanding of race, understanding of the racial history of Austin, understanding of the impacts of race within quality of life outcomes. And then we also ask this question of degree of impact. And what we're really trying to get to with that is, I'm sure a lot of you probably share this view, but there's a narrative within society that it's about individual acts of racism. It's about individual races. So it's the KKK, it's neo-Nazis, it's Proud Boys. But one thing our trainers like to say is you can take all of those explicitly racist people, you send them to the moon, you send them off somewhere, and we'd still have what's been created. We still have these institutions that are creating these outcomes. So we're really trying to lift our analysis from that individual, from blaming people to blaming our systems, to blaming what's been created. And so that's kind of why we ask about that, trying to get to a level of degree or a level of distinction between those. If you want to go to the next slide. And I mentioned the strategic direction earlier. And so this is just like a really brief breakdown. And as I mentioned, there's over 200 metrics. It's a lot of work right now for our performance management group within our financial services to try and begin measuring those, to try and begin looking at where we are and where we need to be. And as I mentioned, we've been identified as a cross-cutting anchor. And so if we're talking about safety, there's disparities in sentencing. Obviously, there's disparities in arrest. There's disparities in treatment that you receive from police. I'm sure that's not usually unfamiliar to people. Within economic opportunity and affordability, there's always the wealth gap. There's employment. One of the metrics that's actually in there is, and I'm paraphrasing here because we couldn't put this in the official city document, but basically they want us to stop losing our Black people, which is kind of great that as a city we recognize that. They codify it in a weird way, and that's a whole other conversation. But so as we're looking at these, there's the explicit ones, and then there's also ones that are just like objective measures, like distance from parkland. And we would say, okay, where do we have parkland? Where are the distances greatest? And it's going to be within our majority community of color neighborhoods, and it's going to be where it's low-income neighborhoods. And so we're trying to be really intentional with how we're framing this data collection. We're trying to make sure it's very intentional and very contextualized in a way where it isn't, because I think also one of the things that happens a lot with data is you can look at it and you start to blame people again. You say like, oh, look, like the median wealth for Black families is like $1 versus 100,000 for white families. Clearly that's a problem for those families, and instead we need to be able to like have that as a conversation, kind of like what we did with, we intentionally put Black people in these neighborhoods, and then we redline these neighborhoods, and then we wouldn't give them loans to buy houses in these neighborhoods, and then we took these homes away from them anyway, even if they were able to get them. And so trying to make sure that we're very intentional and, as I said, contextualized around that. And I do believe that's it. Okay, and then one more slide, so we can go to the next one. And as I mentioned, like we don't do a good job within the city. We serve the entire community. We serve all of the city of Austin, and we don't have data around that. We have like at the aggregate level, as you've seen, we get named like best city to live, healthiest city. But as an example, like Black women's birth outcomes within the state of Texas and within the city of Austin are worse here than they are in Cuba as a country. And like, that's just crazy to me that anybody could name this city a healthiest city for women. Like, you need to be clear about what women you're talking about. It's white women. And so trying to make sure that we're collecting that data, that we're being critical within our data collection, being critical within what we're doing. Oh, and like the other example that's really pressing for us right now is our homelessness crisis right now. 42% of all homeless people are Black, and our city as a whole is maybe 6 or 7% Black. So, I mean, that's just a huge disparity. Like, that's undeniable to me that you can look at that and not see that our systems and our institutions, it's not that they're broken, they're working as they were designed to do, and we need to do really intentional work to transform that, to change that, and to create an Austin where we really can be the most livable, most sustainable city for all. And so I think that was the last slide. If there are any questions.
Thank you, Brandon and Kelly. That was, really interesting. Great to hear about the work you're doing. I appreciate the history and the focus on assessing where you are today as a city or a county, a certain geographic area, and then really trying to figure out how you got to where you are, and then how do you address those structural, long-standing issues. And so, again, I just want to make the connection back to, we talked a little bit about that idea of procedural justice and basing decisions on accurate data and including all stakeholders in the decision making and using a clear set of criteria for making decisions. And I think, and then acknowledging mistakes. And I think we can see elements of all of that in both the work that the Financial Justice Project is doing in San Francisco and the work that the Equity Office is doing in Austin. Is so much of this work was driven by the community. It includes, acknowledging mistakes that have been made in the past, and then using data, whatever data you can get your hands on, right, to change things and change those structures, again, that you talked about, Brandon, that have sort of led to things being the way they are today. So I appreciate that very much. I want us to do our last question here, our last poll question. We have question number 6, is what do you think could most benefit your organization in regard to promoting equitable financial decision making? So we have a couple options here. One is decision makers having a better understanding of past policies that promoted inequity. B, more and more meaningful community involvement or engagement. C is identifying equity as a priority for the organization and creating an equity office. And D is using data more in decision making. So take a look and respond to the poll. Okay, the poll has closed. We'll see where folks are with that. Looks like the majority of folks answered B, so more and more meaningful community involvement and engagement. Again, that is not surprising to me. I think community engagement is an ongoing challenge for a lot of local governments, and something I think a lot of places could do better. So again, I want to thank all of the co-presenters today, Melanie and Krista and Brandon and Kelly. I think it was a very, we heard a lot of interesting information. I hope you attendees got some good food for thought, ideas for ways that your local government could start to embrace some of these ideas and implement some of these ideas. I did want to mention a couple of things as follow-up, if these are ideas you want to pursue further. First, we have our book, Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities, will be coming out very shortly, probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. We have our final Financial Foundations webinar coming up on October 24th, where that will be sort of putting all the pillars together and how they all come together to, again, help you strengthen your financial foundation. And then finally, we are really trying to gather more case studies as it relates to not just this pillar number 5, but all components of the Financial Foundations framework. So if you're interested in sharing something that you've done, please reach out to me or my colleague Shane Kavanaugh. We'd love to hear from you and capture your story in a case study that we can share with all GFOA members. So again, thank you very much, and you all have a great afternoon.